Bleh. We have Night of the Living Dead, the 1990 remake, of course, directed by Tom Savini, written by George Romero. There is a fate worse than death. In this remake of the classic 1968 film, a group of people are trapped inside a farmhouse as the legions of the Walking Dead try to get inside and use them for food. Now, I could sit here and I could talk about this movie for hours. I could talk about the original Night of the Living Dead for 5 fucking hours without getting tired. And I could definitely talk about the remake in the same kind of way. The remake came about because they had lost the copyright to the original film, and this was a way for them to kind of cash in on something that had always kind of eluded them. Now, here's the irony, the paradoxical irony of Night of the Living Dead. And the reason why Night of the Living Dead went into the public domain in the first place was because they had chopped off the title cards. It was originally going to be called Night of the Living Annibus or Night of the Flesh Eaters. And they chopped off the title cards and they never put the copyright on the new title, Night of the Living Dead. So when it was screened publicly, for some reason that enters things into the public domain. What had started in the 50s was you had all the Universal horror films were packaged, right? I'd love to do a whole show on this, actually. They were packaged and sold off for television for the first time. And you had monster kids in the 60s discovering all of these movies that had existed and sort of languished in obscurity, in some cases 20 years prior, right? And now all of a sudden, Lugosi and Karloff, they're becoming household names. Claude Rains, they're becoming household names all over again because of this resurgence. And one of the things that comes with this licensing of these films is that you have these monster TV shows, right? These local monster hosts. You have Zachary and you have Elvira and you have Svengoolie, all these different guys, and they're all regional and local. You have the development of chiller theater. All that comes about. It is in this format, in this medium, in this venue that Night of the Living Dead gets shown everywhere in every kind of way to monster kids in the 70s, right? To fast forward a bit, because now you have these local programs. And so this movie gets vultured in every conceivable way by the Sunday night monster matinee movie, right? You have Bill Cardille, who's in it, Chilly Billy. He was the Pittsburgh one. And so the filmmakers received worldwide recognition, particularly George Romero, who got put on the map along with the other guys in Image 10, John Russo, Russ Streiner, Gary Streiner, Rudy Ricci to a lesser extent, although there is a split between George Romero and Russo and Streiner. Russo and Streiner, they go off and do their thing, and Romero does his own thing. But they come back together in 1989 to make this remake, and you have Romero as the executive producer and the writer, and he rewrites his script, and he does something that I think every single good remake should do, which is subvert the original in some way. And so about, 2/3 of the way through, he kind of starts to really veer off the track from his original script. I say his script, it's not just his script. He co-wrote it with John Russo, but everybody knows that George Romero is the writer, the true writer of Night of the Living Dead. Not to diminish whatever John Russo contributed, but it was one of those kinds of things. Listen, John Russo did a bang-up job with the Return of the Living Dead novelization. That's a whole other story that we already have on the channel, so I'm not going to go into that right now. So they do this movie, and of course they get Tom Savini to direct, and Tom Savini is the perfect person to direct the Night of the Living Dead movie. However, it's neutered. There's a lot of hectic behind the scenes surrounding the production. Savini doesn't get to shoot 30% of the film. It gets edited to shit, so all the gory bits get taken out. And in this way, it's sort of like an imperfect, perfect remake. So it's perfect in the sense that it sort of subverts the original. It goes different places, particularly with Barbara, who's portrayed by Patricia Tallman, and she is just this fierce, strong-willed heroine that is sort of opposite of Judith O'Dea's original Barbara, who also, has this heroic sacrifice that gets overwritten for Barbara as the sole survivor of the Night of the Living Dead. Harry Cooper survives the night as well, but she takes him out. It's the whole ending is different. It's great too. And of course, Tony Todd just does such a great job as Ben. I mean, he really does Dwayne Jones the justice that anybody would have to do to even enter such large shoes as Dwayne Jones. I wish the movie pushed the envelope harder than it does, but it doesn't diminish how great it is. We get the same sort of, like, Savini really understands the subject matter, of course, because he's a disciple of George Romero. And there's nobody that George Romero should trust more to direct Night of the Living Dead than someone like Tom Savini. It makes sense. It just surprises me that there's not more corpse eating. I watched the director's cut for the first time at the Alamo Drafthouse. And so I wasn't sure what to expect, right? I wasn't sure. It starts off in black and white. And once the cemetery ghoul appears, everything goes to color. And I kind of felt like that didn't really matter. That was kind of meaningless. Why would you do that? It was sort of just unnecessary because, like, I don't know. It wasn't Wizard of Oz and it wasn't, Rocky Horror. What was the point of that? It's a remake. It's supposed to be in color. We didn't need that nod. There are other ways to do nods to the original. Even the beginning, there's subversions of the beginning, kind of like red herring to sort of trick us because we were very familiar with Night of the Living Dead. So we know where it's going to go. And it's like, we don't want, and I think that's what George Romero wanted. He's like, you already know the story. I want to give you something slightly different. I really respect that. I would say there was a cycle of remakes that really are sort of anchored in the 80s, but started in the 70s. I would say it really started with Invasion of the Bounty Snatchers in 1978, starring Donald Sutherland. You have Jeff Goldblum in there. That was just the beginning of this incredible trend of remaking these movies from the 50s and the 60s. And it continued on, of course, with John Carpenter's The Thing, which everybody considers to be immaculate, part of the Holy Trinity within the greater spectrum of remakes, and then followed up by The Fly, David Cronenberg's The Fly, and of course, The Blob, right? And then I would say, though it was made in 89, but it came out in 90, you have Night of the Living Dead. And those five are, like, to me, that's the upper echelon of immaculate, perfect remakes that are just as great in their own way as the originals themselves. Lesser ones are Tobe Hooper's Invaders from Mars, as well as Blood Diner, which is a remake / sequel to Blood Feast, which was supposed to be Blood Feast 2, which was supposed to have a soundtrack by the Misfits, by the way. One thing that I've noticed in this last watch that I've noticed it in the previous time I watched Night of the Living Dead is sort of the politics of location between Ben and Harry Cooper. It's the greatest aspect of what makes Night of the Living Dead work so well is not the living versus the dead. The dead are sort of this primer for the pressure cooker that's taking place in the house. That's where the real focus is. It's the antagonism between people put in a horrible situation and trying to survive and endure, and what happens when you're put in this pressure cooker of a situation. And you have these two schools of thought from two leaders or people that are, I hate to use this word, alpha, right? They're alpha in their sort of approach to everything. You have Ben, who's coming from the city, and you have Harry Cooper, who is also not neighbors, as Harry Cooper says. You don't look like neighbors yourself. Harry Cooper and Helen Cooper and their daughter Sarah are coming from some engagement. They're dressed like in a tuxedo, where although in the original they're just sort of dressed in a suit and tie and whatnot. I would say the antagonism from Harry Cooper in the original is vastly different from the one in the remake. In the original, Harry Cooper is selfish, but he's not inherently evil. Everything he does is sort of done in service to his family or in service to his ideology and his way of being. This Harry Cooper is selfish in a very deeply sort of evil and egotistical way. Ben and Harry have egos in the original Night of the Living Dead, but it's taken to a whole new level where, in a way, it sort of hobbles the character of Harry Cooper. I prefer the Harry Cooper in the original film. He is just way more complex. He wants to do the right thing. He gets blinded by the power of the rifle and wants to be in control of the situation that way. The big conflict between Ben as the protagonist force and Harry Cooper is the antagonist force is the mentality over what makes the most sense. Do we want to stay above ground in the main living space and board up the house where we have options, where we can escape in any way, shape, or form? Or do we want to go down in the cellar where we only have to board up one door and we could just wait to be rescued? And here's where, for me, again, I heard very recently, like, timeless classics are movies that you can revisit over and over and over again, and you're going to learn something new every time, right? And that's why you can watch them over and over and over again, because they're so rich that they just keep giving. And for me, what I noticed, I've talked before about the racial aspects. They weren't intentional, but in casting a black man as Ben, the movie suddenly, all of the protagonistic, antagonistic conflict becomes deeply racially charged, especially for the time period, right? And in this case, you also have the politics of location. Ben is a black man traveling through the rural back countryside, terrified of not just the dead, but also the fucking living. When you think about it, like, it's not, that subtext is not there consciously in what Romero wrote, but it's definitely there as a viewer. You have to imagine that Ben is just as worried about getting shot up by some white folks as he is by getting his ass chewed on by fucking dead people coming out of the ground. And then you have Harry Cooper, who is perfectly happy to, like, corner himself in a basement where there is no way to escape and just simply wait to be rescued. Because in his politics of location, that's what would happen. Some good old boys are going to come down there and rescue him, and he's going to be fine. But for a black guy like Ben, he's like, fuck no, I can't rely on that. The only person I can rely on is myself, and I need you. We need to rely on each other through this teamwork to survive the night. And what's interesting, the irony of the original film is that Ben does survive the night in the very place that Harry Cooper suggested. However, the irony is that when Ben comes out of the basement, he's murdered by a guy with a gun at the behest of a sheriff. All they say is, oh, there's another one. And you can read that in a million different ways. Now, on the surface level, you could say, oh, he's talking about another ghoul, another zombie. But there's this weird sort of uncomfortable subtext of, like, he might just very well be saying, oh, look, there's a black guy, shoot him, like, straight the fuck up. And after 2020, that gets compounded, man, when you think, and it gets intensified as the years, like, that's why Night of the Living Dead is this very contemporary thing. The way that it ends, that all that kind of gets eroded a little bit with the remake, a little bit, in the fact that it's Harry Cooper survives at the end, and Ben dies from wounds inflicted by Harry. The way that Romero rewrites the scene, it's like the clashing of two egos. And maybe that's also evocative of the time period. You know, we're leaving the 80s, coming into the 90s. In the 90s, there was this, like, renewed optimism that we're living in this more enlightened time and that racism is kind of gone, right? Like, there was this sort of, like, utopic view of, like, the 90s, of, like, the modern 90s where racism doesn't exist anymore. And so therefore, maybe that conflict doesn't work in the same way. Now, mind you, I can't say for certain in the 60s when Romero claims that when they were making Night of the Living Dead, they weren't thinking about race and they had cast Dwayne Jones because he was the best man for the job. And I truly believe that. But I also have to believe that somewhere in Dwayne Jones's mind, perhaps, maybe, that he is thinking about race. As the only black cast member in Pittsburgh, it does make you wonder, and then possibly the only black cast or crew member. I don't know if there were any other black crew members, but it makes you sort of want, and really it's a testament to the progressive nature of Image 10, but also that, how did they not think of race? You know, how was race not thought of, especially at that time with the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. gets assassinated? Like, you have to think that race comes into the making of that movie. I don't know. I mean, the only people that could really answer that question now are Russ Streiner and John Russo and Gary Streiner, because they're the only ones left alive. They're the only ones there. But Russ Streiner, I mean, he was the filmmaker on Night of the Living Dead. He is a good first eyewitness source. I've been wanting to interview him for the longest time. I met John Russo a long time ago. He seemed very, very crabby, bitter man. I would love to interview Russ Streiner. I don't know if he'd ever do it. I tried to get him some years back, and he was a little apprehensive. Who knows? We'll see. I love this, Dominique. You're so right. Good movies are like onions, many layers, and you might cry or have a good time. Well fucking said. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to go.